Hello, and welcome to Beering in Mind Beer Reviews. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. In general, we review one beer at a time and talk about it and evaluate it in terms of its aroma and flavor, appearance, etc. Today we're going to look at a book, and my original plan was to do a book review every 50 beer reviews. Somehow it just kept on snowballing and I got up to 100 reviews, but now I've decided it's time to do it, and I will do another book perhaps in either 50 or 100 more beer reviews. But today is probably the most important book for Japanese craft beer. And the movie critic Roger Ebert once said that the next best thing to watching a movie was reading about movies. And I don't know if that is true for beer. Movies, of course, have a long tradition of criticism, movie reviews in newspapers, and that's something that beer just does not have. We have magazines, of course, and there are books, yes. But it doesn't have that long tradition of criticism. However, the book that we're talking about today does exactly that. It looks at the Japanese beer scene in a kind of from a long, wide perspective and from a very narrow perspective as well. So looking at beer in terms of its history here in Japan, its geography, as well as individual breweries and individual beers. Well, enough of antipasto. Here is the book. It is called Craft Beer in Japan, and the subtitle is The Essential Guide. And this is by Mark Meli, who is an American, a professor here in Japan, professor of philosophy, and now a professor of beer as well. He writes a regular column in the Japan Beer Times, and he's sometimes in demand as a lecturer too as well, both in Japan and abroad on beer. And this book came out in 2013. It's published by Brightwave Media, and it runs 207 pages, and I'm going to go through it section by section briefly. Mark Meli has probably more experience and knowledge of beer, and certainly of Japanese beer, of anyone I know, and I should disclose that I do know him. So what I say here today is probably not going to be objective. He has sampled and evaluated over 10,000 beers, also beer bars, festivals, breweries. He's traveled around the world. Not constantly, but he is traveling a lot to many, many different places to sample beer and to write about beer. Well, this book is a little bit different. Many beer books begin with a section on beer history, beer making, ingredients, and world styles of beer. That's pretty much the given for many beer books, and you know, if you've read one, you've probably read them all. That's probably not fair to say, but the point is that so many beer books begin with these sections on history and the elements of beer making that it gets a little tiring to see all of that again and again. Mark Meli's book does not do that. So this book does open with a history of beer in Japan, and it includes a kind of important point that Japanese sake is actually a rice beer. It's sometimes referred to as a rice wine, but it's a beer because it's not made from fruit, fermented fruit. It's made from a grain, which is rice. He does talk a little bit about the history of craft beer in Japan, including the important date of 1994 when the law changed, the tax law changed in Japan. Prior to this law change, you had to make 2 million liters of beer per year to get a beer license. And that, of course, is prohibitive for most small breweries. It's just impossible to do that. So what that did was that before 1994 meant that only very large companies such as Kirin, Asahi, and so forth could make beer. In 1994, the law changed to allow people to make 60,000 liters of beer, and it actually had a kind of important provision, which was you had to make at least 6,000 liters of what's called happoshu. So that means something that includes fruit or spice, additives, or non-fermentables, so things that won't produce alcohol. And 6,000 liters is very doable for many people, and so many craft breweries, many small breweries in Japan started with happoshu license, allowing them to brew a minimum of 6,000 liters. And even today, well, up until another recent change, many breweries were simply adding something to their beer to make it qualify as happoshu, not as beer. In the late 1990s, however, the number of breweries in Japan had risen to over 400. Many people started breweries, including many people who should not have. Many companies, restaurants, resort areas opened a brewery just on a whim, saying we can probably make money doing it. But they, of course, could not, and their beer was not very good. And so many of them went out of business. So a lot of bad beer, and the craft beer scene more or less collapsed, not entirely. But in 2010, there was a second wave of breweries that arrived, and it's been holding steady since then and rising. And according to recent statistics, there are almost 400 breweries now in Japan again. And Meli goes on to describe a number of jibiru styles in the book. And in the early craft beer scene in Japan, everybody had to make a Pilsner, an Alt beer, and a Kelch, German styles, which had been traditional in Japan. And Meli describes especially Pils and Weizen beer. He has a number of essays, short essays, and one of them is on what he calls jibiru and Japanese identity. And jibiru was the early term for craft beer in Japan. Ji meaning local or regional beer, and now most craft brewers prefer to use craft biru. I think that jibiru is kind of old-fashioned. In any case, he posits that beverages, including beer, are a strong part of national identity. And in Japan, and this is part of Meli's specialty, in the post-war period in Japan, there's an idea or an academic school called Nihonjinron, which is theories about Japan or theories about the Japanese, the qualities of what it means to be Japanese. And in this section, he talks a lot about how beer makers try to create a Japanese-style beer. And of course, easiest way to do that is to find a native ingredient that works well in beer, or at least works in a beer. And so we see that in many craft beers in Japan. They will use a special type of rice, perhaps, and add that into the beer mix, or a certain type of Japanese fruit. And part of the idea is also to create beer that fits the Japanese palate, whatever that might mean. And many major breweries pride themselves on that, of making a very light beer that fits light Japanese food. And Meli also discusses the idea of nationalism as a marketing tool, kind of much in the same way that, say, Budweiser in the US will use patriotic symbols as an eagle or the red, white, and blue colors of the American flag. or even naming their beer America at certain points. So not Budweiser, but America. So using nationalism as a marketing tool, very powerful. And the book also includes short sections on Japanese food and drink, including discussions of sake and shochu. And then another short section on beer and Japanese language, which is a glossary of terms, brewing terms and beer terms translated into English. And then he gets into kind of a risky thing, I think. He has a series of best of lists, and he takes the risks to go into what he feels are the top 5 small breweries, the top 5 larger breweries, the top 5 beers by style, and top 5 beers overall. So he makes claims for each of those, and it's interesting to read those. Things have changed since this book came out, but it's interesting to see what the situation was at that time. And he also has a list of festivals throughout Japan, beer festivals, which have simply been proliferating since then. And then the heart of the book is this section, which is a Japanese craft brewery guide. And in this section, he goes through 219 different breweries, and he looks at 104 of them in depth, and also talks about 136 brew pubs and bars and tap rooms as well. This is arranged geographically, which is one way to do it. He goes from Hokkaido, northern Japan, down to the south here. And with each brewery, he discusses the history briefly and the regular beers and some of their seasonal or limited beers. And he also has a star rating system, which he uses for each of the beers that he discusses. And this section closes with a discussion of Japanese major breweries, specifically Kirin, Asahi, Suntory, and Sapporo, and also good places to drink in Japan. But the heart of the book is really this section here, the Craft Brewery Guide. There is a Japanese edition of this, which came out in 2017. It's called Nihon no Craft Biru no Subete. And it's available on Amazon in Kindle Edition, as is this print edition as well. The print edition is, again, available from the Japan Beer Times website, and the Kindle edition on Amazon.com. I'll put links to both of those down below in the description section. It is not available on Amazon in the print form. And the Brightwave Media website does not have any information on the book. So if you're interested in this book in a print version, go to Japan Beer Times website. If you'd like it on Kindle, you can get that on Amazon, and you can get the Japanese edition as well on Kindle there. Well, I'm going to stop now and just say that this is probably the best 207 pages you will read on Japanese craft beer, and it will probably remain so until Mark Meli makes a revision and publishes an updated version of it. If you're interested in Japanese beer, get this book. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.